always sounds so suspenseful, doesn't it? Well, welcome all of you for our in-person audience and certainly for our online audience and those who will be watching this on YouTube in its archive state. We are just delighted to have the Archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogan, here with us today, along with my two colleagues and friends. I think Russell and I got haircuts for today, it looks like.
I tried. You're not supposed to notice.
But in any event, we're just glad to see all of you. I thought I would just give some brief introductions. I think most of you know most of us here on the stage. I'm Barbara Perry, and I co-direct with Russell the Presidential Oral History project here at the Miller Center and its program, and we are deep into the Obama project and looking forward to doing our future projects as well. So I thought I'd go in the order in which I have come to know these three individuals on stage, because I'm really honored to call all of them friends and colleagues. So I start with Russell because we go back to graduate school days here together at UVA, where we both got our PhDs in the government department more decades ago than I will admit. Russell may want to tell, but I will not. And Russell is one of the premier presidency scholars in not only in the country but in the world, and certainly worldwide, known for his work in oral history. He is currently working on a book on our Bush 43, George W. Bush oral history project, and that will be published by Oxford University Press. I will now turn to Mark, and I've known Mark ever since I came to the Miller Center 13 years ago. Mark is now our Director of Presidential Studies, which is the largest unit here at the Miller Center, and he also co-chairs, along with Guian McKee, the Presidential Recordings Program. So you can see why we're all here. We're all dealing with what we can know about presidents and when can we know it, if I could borrow a Watergate phraseology. Mark has a PhD in history from Ohio University and is also a premier scholar in his field, which is foreign policy history, and has still a fairly new book out on Kennedy and Vietnam. Many of you may have come for his program here on that, which was superb. And that is called The Kennedy Withdrawal. And so we're just delighted to have both Russell and Mark here to talk about how our programs relate to presidential archives. And now for our guest of honor, Colleen Shogan, who is the 11th Archivist of the United States and the first woman to hold that position. And I said to her in the green room, is there a title like Madam Archivist? And we decided yes, there, Madam Secretary, Mr. President. So I get to call her Colleen, though, if she's amenable. We go back, I think it's 5 or 6 years now at least. I know she has worked with Russell on our oral history interviews in the past, but we started working together when Colleen was the director of the David Rubenstein Center for White House History at the White House Historical Association. And then when I was added to their board of directors, which was a great honor, I got to work with Colleen even more. Before that position, she was assistant director, associate director at the Library of Congress in the research center?
Assistant Deputy Librarian for Collections and Services.
I would never be able to remember that long title, but that was with the Congressional Research Service.
Right.
And then also was the vice chair of the Women's Centennial for Suffrage, for the Women's Suffrage Amendment. And that is also how she got to know Kelsey Millay. Kelsey, wave to everyone in the back there. She was the mentor for Kelsey Millay, who is now has been here with us a year, our new Associate Director of Presidential Studies. And Colleen holds also a political science PhD from Yale University. My favorite thing about Colleen, in addition to just her being a wonderful friend and colleague, is the fact that she also somehow finds time to write mystery novels. Have any of you ever read any of Margaret Truman's, Death in the Supreme Court, or Death in the Kennedy Center? My mother loved those. Colleen's are more alliterative in her titles, so she has Stabbing in the Senate and Homicide in the House, and I'm hoping that those remain fictional titles and don't become headlines in the newspaper. So with that, let us begin, as President Kennedy once said in his inaugural, and that is, tell us us about the National Archives. Most of us know, how many of you have been to the National Archives building? Most people have been at some time to go and pay homage to our founding documents, but people may have gone to do genealogy or do their research and work there. I also want to mention to you while we're speaking, if you have a question that you have already or that has come up to you as we're speaking, feel free to write that down a card. Alfred Reeves IV will come along, and so at any time feel free to wave that and he'll come along. And also for those of you online, please use your Q&A function, and we can sprinkle the questions in between our conversation, or we can hold off until the end. But again, just back to the general concept of the archives. What is it? What's in it? And what do you do in your new job as Archivist of the United States?
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you to the Miller Center, Russell, Mark, for serving on this panel. I'm really excited. It's great for me. Most of my days I spend at the National Archives headquarters in Washington, D.C., or I'm traveling around to one of our 42 facilities across the United States. Many people don't know that we have many facilities across the United States, including our presidential libraries. But I also like to have time in which I'm able to go out and meet people, talk to them about our work. Oftentimes they do this in a university community setting, so I'm really thrilled to be here at UVA, and certainly no better place to be at UVA than the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency. So to answer your question, I mean, if you've been to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., most people know us through the fact that we are the home to the founding documents. If you come inside, and that made headlines last week, we can certainly talk about that if you like, but we are home to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights in our beautiful rotunda in Washington, D.C., and that is certainly by far the most important documents and records that we hold in trust for the American people, but it's really only the tip of the iceberg. We hold in trust, actually, as far as physical records go, 13.5 billion pages of federal records. Not million, billion pages of federal records. And a lot of people also ask, well, what differentiates the archives from the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress, which is a very good question. We are the repository of federal documents and records. We do not collect typically books or other types of materials like that. We collect government records. And there's really two types of government records, roughly speaking, at the National Archives. There's federal records, which are produced at an agency like the Department of Defense or the Department of Commerce or the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Those are federal records. And there are presidential records, which are produced in the execution of the office of the presidency, not just by the president himself or herself, but also by the staff who work directly for the president, and of course also the vice president. So those records coming out of the White House. But largely those are the two types of records that we collect at the National Archives. It's a vast collection. It is predominantly at this point in time pieces of paper, but it's not just pieces of paper. We collect regardless of media. So we have maps, we have photographs, we have film. We have all kinds of bankruptcy records, patents, every type of media that you can imagine. And then, of course, now in the modern age, we have emails, we have born electronic documents, and we have text messages. And of course, the born electronic or born digital records is what's going to grow exponentially in the future. So my day-to-day job, it's varied. I mean, I travel around a lot because I am trying to visit all 42 sites by the end of this calendar year. So I will have only been in office about a year and a half, and I'm trying to hit all 42 sites before the end of 2024. So I'm on the road about 50% of the time, going to meet our staff at our archival locations, find out what their concerns, their problems, their issues are, so that I can make the best decisions that I can as Archivist of the United States. When I'm in Washington, D.C., a lot of my work is done obviously meeting with senior staff there, but it's also interfacing with members of the executive branch. We have a lot of cabinet officials that come in with their staff to see records. We have heads of state, foreign heads of states that come in, and then with members of Congress and senators who are very actively involved in the operations of the archives, our oversight committees, but also just rank and file members of Congress who bring their staff or their constituents to view the records that we have at the National Archives. So that's a lot of how my day is spent when I'm in DC. No 2 days are the same, that's for sure. Very, very busy, but I love it. I'm really excited and thrilled to be in the job.
You mentioned last week's event at the National Archives, and we'll have you speak a little bit about that, but also just general security. In this day and age, we know that there are hacks that can be done in terms of records that are kept, that are electronic, but also physical safety. So tell us about that. Not only that, but there was an incident, many of you might remember, with Sandy Berger, who worked in the Clinton administration and had gone in to do some research on some of the papers, I guess, that he had worked on when he was in the White House, and left with some of them. So how do you ensure for all time the security of this material?
Well, for the physical security, so I was not there for the Berger incident, but I do know, I did read about it when actually I was the nominee, and of course they learned from that incident and what went wrong, specifically why he was able to walk out with several documents, and I can safely tell you that won't happen again because of new security protocols, right, that we have in place that would not allow that to be able to happen. We have very good physical security at the National Archives. Of course, it is an open public building. It is not a closed down public building. We have over 1 million people that come to visit us just at the Washington, D.C. location where I work in any given year. And then there's another 1 million that come to visit the presidential libraries. So we have a lot of people coming in and out. And we want the facilities to be that way because the records are held in trust for the American people. They're not, the property of the National Archives. So they're our property, our responsibility, but they're held in trust for the United States and the people who live in the United States, American citizens. So we want to be able to facilitate access. I'm adamant about being able to facilitate access. We have to do that in a way, of course, that's responsible. For the digital documents, that's a common question we get because people get very concerned, particularly when we have records, and as we're already seeing this in presidential records, and we will soon see this for federal records, that are born digital. So they will never be physical in nature. They will never be printed out. There will never be anything that you can touch unless you choose to print it out. But they're not coming to us in that analog format. And so we store those in the cloud, and we have them in 4 different cloud locations. That is for security reasons. That is from federal IT standards and security standards that we follow stringently, and we are always abreast of when those security standards change with the various cloud providers that we have. So that ensures that if there is any sort of security breach with one of those providers, that there would be a triplicate actually in backup for those records.
Right. Well, Mark, let me turn to you. I know in our conversations getting ready for today that you had some questions about declassification issues, and particularly how that relates not only to your own research in foreign policy, but also for presidential recordings.
Yeah, first of all, thanks to Colleen for being here. The work that I do with my colleagues, including Guillen McKee, co-chair of the recordings program, it's dependent upon the work that you do. And not only declassifying these records that we get on presidents from Franklin Roosevelt through Richard Nixon, the presidents who taped secretly during their time in office, a little bit of Ronald Reagan too, and I can talk about that in a second. But it's crucial for us to have the support of the archives, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, who has been working with us since our program was founded. And really, it's I'm thrilled to be able to thank you in person for all the support that you've given us. And true, as Barbara says, the materials that we work with in the recordings program, these secret White House tapes, they had to be first declassified, and they first had to be converted into presidential records as a result of the Presidential Records Act 1978. These materials started to come online, be available to the public in 1981. But the public didn't start to really get access to the presidential recordings, the secret White House tapes, really until the 1990s for the most part. And we have Lady Bird Johnson in many ways to thank for that, because she was so crucial in making sure that the records of her husband Lyndon got out much faster than he himself wanted them to, so that we could learn, and so that there was some transparency and some accountability, which is really two parts of the same coin, I think, for what we do, because these records are our property. They were made our property by act of Congress. But it's a trust, and our ability to consult these materials, to learn from these materials, it's extremely important. You have to know where you've been to know where you're going. And these materials that my colleagues and I work with are perhaps some of the most intimate materials that we have, because you're literally a fly on the wall listening to Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and others formulate policy in real time, with all the starts and the stops associated with that. With the affective domain, you can hear their exasperation, their excitement, their concern. Emotion is shot through in all of these conversations, and so they're incredibly rich. But they do have to be declassified first. Many of those records, most of those records now are all declassified. They were done so in bulk in a series of tranches over the years. Some remain classified, and that's usually because of concerns about sources and methods, and a reluctance to shine some sunlight on them for good reasons in many cases. But others we simply have to ask for. So if there is a record that has been withheld, and we think it's crucial to understanding, let's say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board record tape, in fact, remains classified, we have to ask for that. And while presidential records, there's a calendar for them becoming available to the public, they're not automatically declassified. You have to then ask for these records to be declassified. And that's not just with tapes, that's also with the textual records that we work with. Any number of times I have gone in and made a request, either for mandatory review or a Freedom of Information Act request. Can I please see documents X, Y, and Z in this folder? And because of resource challenges which we can talk about, oftentimes it takes years to get those. And then even when you get them, it's probably more often the case than not, I'm sad to say, that they don't really move the ball for your own research project. But it's important that you continue to do this, because then you're helping everybody who comes after you. And now, with our ability to put many of these documents online, I think it's even more valuable for that process to move along. So declassification is really at the heart of what we do, of what we can know, and we're supportive of everything we can do to move that process forward.
Russell, can I turn to you to talk about how our program, the one that you and I co-chair, Presidential Oral History Program here, how does it fit into this picture, and how we figure out particularly what presidents did when they did it?
Certainly happy to contribute, thank you. Oral history actually is a method that both supplements and complements the written record. As much as we have in writing about the modern presidency, there's still an awful lot of important business that's conducted in person, verbally. And so, notwithstanding this vast amount of written documentation, there's a lot that can be learned, not from consulting the records, but from talking with people who were actually in the room when important decisions were made. And so what we typically do after presidential administration leaves office is we try to sit down with about the top 100 officials within every administration. That's at the assistant to the president level, chiefs of staff, national security advisor, as well as cabinet officers, and to systematically interview them about their experiences. Colleen came in. We decided at a minimum of 4 occasions when she was here earlier to help us in doing these interviews. We try to spend about a day and a half with people systematically debriefing them, because importantly, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get written down or that doesn't get communicated in a public pronouncement. I mean, this is an age-old issue. Montaigne wrote 500 years ago that he would actually prefer to know what the commander said in his tent among his friends the night before battle than what he said in public the day that the battle took place. And so what we try to do is to find out what was happening in the tent, if you will, for each administration. This has become actually more problematic over time. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a wonderful article on the writing of contemporary history for the Atlantic magazine back in 1967 when he said, you know, the advent of the telephone has created real problems for historians because there's so much business conducted by phone or in person. Things don't happen in writing. What you want to do is to have, again, the occasion to come and to interview people. And Schlesinger said in that article, imagine what it would be like to have interviews with George Washington or Ralph Waldo Emerson, the enrichment of our historical record. So in effect, what we try to do is to complement that. Moreover, because of the harsh investigative climate of Washington in the post-Watergate era, the post-Iran-Contra era, people in the White House don't keep careful written records or discursive diaries in the way that they used to. One of the most commonplace comments made in the interviews when we're conducting them is, don't bother looking for a paper trail on this because it won't exist, notwithstanding the existence of this mass archive. So what we try to do is to fill that historical vacuum. The second advantage to doing the interviews in the way that we do them is because, quite frankly, there's a problem with the execution of the Presidential Records Act. And I want to sit before you and be an advocate for my colleague, Colleen here, who needs help. She needs lots of help. She needs lots and lots of money because there is a mismatch between the volume of materials that's created with every presidential administration and the person power, the people that we have allocated. And let me give you an illustration of this. The George W. Bush Library, and I just grabbed this before I came in, has 70 million document pages of presidential records, 200 million emails. And they employ, at least 3 or 4 years ago in the testimony that I was able to grab, they employ 13 full-time equivalent archivists to process those materials. Importantly, although the law provides for opening the vast majority of presidential records after 12 years, I believe, is that correct?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's no access up to 5 years, but years 5 through 12. There's PRA restrictions in the Act and FOIA restrictions. Then post 12 years, it's just FOIA.
Right. There is a perception that this material will all become available immediately after that 12-year period expires. But what has to happen by law is one of those 13 archivists has to sit down and go line by line through every one of those documents in order to make sure that there isn't personal privacy information. If you go into the White House, they're going to take your Social Security number, they're going to put it on a manifest to get you cleared into the White House. You can't have your Social Security number released later on, or if there's a national security issue, it has to be scrubbed. And so one of these 13 people has to sit down and examine these documents before anything could come out. And I've run calculations on this, and I think the paper records, I believe, given the past performance, indicates that it would be roughly 400 years.
Well, I think it's important. Yes, that's right. So the review for FOIA standards has to go through. But what people often forget with the PRA is that also the incumbent president has to be notified of the release, and the president whose records you're talking about has to be notified if that president is still alive. And in the case of George W. Bush, he is still alive, and the incumbent, President Biden, has not waived privilege on those records. So you're talking about a White House review and White House counsel review and a George W. Bush review as well. So add that on top of the FOIA. That is how the law is written.
So the perception is that this vast amount of paperwork that mainly exists in the presidential libraries will be available to historians, when in point of fact, only a tiny, minuscule amount of these things would be available at any point in time. And so part of the argument that we make about presidential oral history is, at least because we're not subject to the restrictions of the Presidential Records Act, we can sit down and systematically converse with somebody for a day or two, or in the case with Dick Cheney, whose interviews still haven't been open, 5 days, with a panel of scholars recording about 23 to 24 hours of interviews. This then becomes the lifeblood of historians and political scientists working on these administrations until such time as Colleen and her dedicated crew can do the job that we ask them to do.
Well, I think this is the time to recognize the proverbial elephant in the room. And by using that animal, I don't mean to indicate any particular party. But talking about presidential records, they have been in the news of late. And so tell us what the Presidential Records Act requires. Where did it come from? How long have we had it? And in your new position as Archivist of the United States, do you work with incumbent presidents and presidencies on that? How do you work with post-presidencies and dealing with records? And we also have to grant there is some litigation involved in this topic, and so Colleen cannot speak openly about those kinds of legal issues, but more generally.
So the Presidential Records Act comes from 1978, so it's a fairly new law. Before that, presidential records were not the property of the American people or the federal government. They were personal papers of the president, which subsequently, post-FDR, were donated to a presidential library. But those have their own gift agreements that govern access to those documents, not administered by the Presidential Records Act.
And that could just be up to each president.
That's correct.
How to handle that.
That's correct. So the post-PRA presidents, this is past during the Carter presidency, so it applies to Reagan forward. It does not apply to Carter, so it's Reagan forward are the PRA presidents. And that means the Presidential Records Act defines what a presidential record is. It's any documentary evidence in which the president is executing his duties. They can be constitutional duties, they can be statutory duties, they can be ceremonial duties, and execution of the office of the president. And then it also designates what other people are subject to the Presidential Records Act, which is mostly the people that are close around the president that support him. And the PRA establishes that and establishes that presidents are the owners of their records as long as they remain in office. But as soon as that term of office ends, usually on January 20th at noon, then the presidential records come to the National Archives and under the custodianship of the Archivist of the United States. But that's really important for people. That's an important distinction because I'll fast forward to one of the endpoints of your question. Do we provide consultation to an incumbent president? Of course we do. If a incumbent president, typically the records are run out of the White House counsel's office, records management. If they have questions, we're always going back and forth, being able to provide consultation. Sometimes there's early disposition of records that are not of evidentiary value, things like, people that are coming in the White House, not, like some some of the security information and things like that. There's still a record of who's coming into the White House, but more of the things that are made online, the waives, reservations made online, some of those things are disposed of, and that goes through, though, the National Archivist. The U.S. Archivist would be approve those dispositions. But those are not, let me say my records, those are not the property of the National Archives at that point in time. So I have no authority, nor would you expect me to have any authority to tell the president what he can do with his records as long as he is in office. But there is a clear line of demarcation when that term of office ends. Then they come into the possession of the National Archives, and then they are subject to everything in the Presidential Records Act for access.
Does that mean am I hearing this correctly? Does that mean an incumbent president could destroy documents?
No, an incumbent president cannot destroy documents because that's covered in the PRA. Because if it's a presidential record as defined by the PRA, it has to be maintained by the White House to be able to be preserved. They are not able to just destroy presidential records. Like I said, there is a way in which they can engage in disposition of records, but those records have to come, they have to explain what they're disposing of, why they are not of evidentiary value, and there's typical records, like I said, that are commonly disposed of throughout the term of office, but they would not be, memos to the president, nothing that relates to the president's execution of the office of the president.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that we have a Presidential Records Act because of a fear that a president or a past president might actually have wanted to destroy some records, and that's Richard Nixon. So in fall of 1974, Congress passed the Presidential Records and Materials Preservation Act, which made sure that those records, particularly Nixon's tapes, were not at his own disposal to destroy. And through the next several years, Congress moved along, established several commissions to take a look at this, and lo and behold, we get a Presidential Records Act in 1978.
Do I recall, Mark, that Richard Nixon, because there hadn't been an act such as this, and to Colleen's point about presidents being able to go off with their records, and if, happily, if they donated them to the Library of Congress or to the archives, fine, but if not, okay, or maybe they put them in the library. But what did Nixon want to do with his records?
Hold on to them, use them for his own personal gain at times, to use them as a tax write-off at one point, and there was litigation about that. In fact, there were 20 years of litigation, essentially, with the Nixon estate over the disposition of his records. And
tax write-off in that if he donated them to the archives, then he would take a tax write-off as his personal archive and papers.
Property, right. And then ultimately, the Nixon materials became fully accessible to all of us in 2007 or so, I think, when they were all moved from Washington to some of them were in Yorba Linda already, but when the Nixon Library became part of the National Archives and Records Administration itself. So there's a long history of legal wrangling between Nixon and then ultimately the Nixon estate and the federal government.
Right. Russell, any thoughts about presidential libraries? You've worked so closely with several of them in putting together the oral history projects. Can you tell us about that? Because that's been a really important component of our program.
Sure. I mean, I'd be really eager to hear Colleen on this point as well, because there is some debate about whether it's a good idea to have these things spread out all over the country, or whether it would be better to have the main part of the libraries, at least the archival piece of it, in a central location like Washington. Our experience has usually been with the library foundations. Though, we have this rather odd set of circumstances by my lights in the United States, where when a president leaves office, basically the first thing he or eventually she does is to engage in a massive amount of fundraising in order to build a library, and this will take 5 or 6, 10 years or whatever. And then there's a ceremony where, after all of this fundraising, they will take the key and then hand it over to, is it the archivist at that point?
The National Archives. It would become a National Archives building.
Right.
Yes.
So it goes from a privately held building to a publicly held building
Right.
at that point.
In many of the complexes, there are private parts of the complex. For example, at the Reagan Library, if you've ever been to the Reagan Library, they have whole parts of that complex that are run by the foundation, and still owned by the foundation. But the museum itself, where the records are stored, those are National Archives installations within that.
And so let me just turn this over to you then to comment on it. And is it your sense that that's a valuable part of the equation that you're inheriting, or are there ways that it could be improved? And if I might ask, the Obama library is a different kettle of fish.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about that.
So you might not be surprised. I mean, I've studied the presidency. That was my area of focus when I was a political scientist, and continued to work on the presidency when I worked at the White House Historical Association. I did have that detour in Congress for like 12 years, but now I'm back, so that's good. And I'm a huge fan of the presidential library system. I am. I think it is, in some ways, one of the most important things that we do at the National Archives. And I've visited a little bit more than half of the presidential libraries. I'll visit the remainder before the end of the year. And every time I pull up to a presidential library, I'm automatically re-energized because when I walk in, oftentimes I'll tell you a story. When I walked into George H.W. Bush's library down in College Station, beautiful. If you've never been there, I really encourage you to go. I was immediately greeted by like 400 school kids were there, like in third, fourth grade, somewhere around that age range. They had brought in a huge contingent of kids from the surrounding area. They were doing a program in the auditorium. Brett Baer was there talking about his new kids book about history detectives that fly all over, time travel and things like that, fun. But giving them a talk about why studying history can be fun and important. And then they were going to go out and see the library after the presentation in the auditorium. And when you go to these libraries, and even if you're not going there for research, if you're going as just a curious, interested American to learn more about that particular presidency, you're going to learn, yes, about that presidency and about the first family and how that individual came to the White House and what he did while was in office. But it's really a chronicle of that era of history. So the Reagan Library is a good example. It's really a museum about the 1980s, which I really love because I grew up in the 80s. So it was like going back to, that was my youth, and to be able to see that chronicled. These are great repositories for us across the country. I think Reagan called them classrooms of democracy. I think that was the quote that Ronald Reagan used at the dedication of his own library. We have to use these libraries as places where young people or any American really can come to learn about the role of the United States government, how the presidency fits within the United States constitutional system, and both our successes and our failures as presidents, as leaders, as a nation, as in a country. So I view them as incredible outreach posts for doing just that. In addition to, of course, researchers being able to go and do serious research for books and articles and dissertations and all the other things that researchers go to libraries and archives to work on. Now, the Obama Library is different. Once again, decisions made before I became the archivist of the United States. So President Obama is building a presidential center in the south side of Chicago. I have toured the entire presidential center as it's being constructed. They gave me an extensive tour of what he's building, which will be quite impressive and beautiful. But President Obama is a little bit different because he's the first president, really digital president. Close to 93% of all of his records are born digital records, okay, as president. There's only a small portion of all of his records that are actually physical or analog, okay? So he's basically our first digital president. There was, in Bush, W as well, but Obama is where it hits to the vast majority of the records are born digital. So what he wanted to do, this is what has been told to me and what I've read, He wanted to create the first digital presidential library. So what he did was he creates a presidential center that's going to have some exhibits, and it's going to have a lot of things that he's interested in as far as his legacy for his time as president. But then the foundation very generously sponsored us, the National Archives, and paid for the remaining digitization of those records, the 7-8% that is analog. We have very high-powered digitization machines in place in Chicago right now, where we are moving through the digitization of those records, has already started, the paper records, and then we are also, there's a lot of objects in a presidential library as well, because all the gifts that come to the White House are presidential records, so foreign gifts or gifts from American people. So we're also photographing all of those gifts and all those objects in really high resolution images, so they will be able to be shared. And we're working with the Obama Foundation right now about how we can have a presence on the Obama Presidential Center Library campus. We won't have a building, but how some of our archivists can have a presence to be able to help researchers that come that want to use the Obama Digital Library that need a little bit of assistance, but also help kids that are coming and they want to do a report on something related to the Obama presidency for their 8th grade history class. We'll be able to also walk those kids through how to use that online digital library.
One of my most vivid recollections of first visiting the Clinton Library was the gifts floor, an entire floor of the storage yard with scores of sets of golf clubs that people had given President Clinton over time. So I don't know what use is put to any. I don't know whether he's allowed to borrow those and use, but just like endless sets of golf clubs.
Mm-hmm. This is an important point, though, about what has happened in the past and what's happening now, and with the digitization of these records and the ability that we have. I mean, in many ways, the very process of research is democratized, which is fabulous, right? It's a real plus. At the same time, though, I have worked in any number of presidential libraries, and you get to know, in the archive space, the specialists in foreign relations, and so you rely on those people when you go there, oftentimes multiple times, and they're very, very helpful. And so the ability for the archives to make that kind of a resource available in the future to people who are doing research in the archives, in the digital space, will need to be creative.
Absolutely, and I think that is one of the reasons why I'm in the job, is not because I was trained as an archivist or a librarian, I was not, but I was a user. And that's what really resonated with President Biden and his team, was they wanted to make sure that we worked on things like access. And access is from people, like I said, people that walk into a presidential library and simply want to learn something about that presidency or that era, all the way to our more specialized users and researchers. So I'm always asking, what are we doing? How can we improve the in-person research experience, the online research experience, our casual visitor experience? Because if we don't have access, then what's the point? We can preserve and we can protect, and that's our other part of our core mission, to preserve and protect those records, but we need to work and focus on sharing those records and providing access to them to as many Americans as possible.
And Colleen, just to be clear, notwithstanding the digitization, your staff still has the same clearance procedures, right? I mean, you still have to do that line by line.
Oh, yeah, for the Obama, yes, right. It doesn't matter, once again, the medium of the record doesn't matter. What matters is the law. So you treat an email or an electronic record like an email the same that you would treat a printed out, memo from the Reagan era.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
How many of you have been to at least one presidential library? Wow. Great. Well, you can get a passport that you can, they'll stamp it each time you go to a new presidential library.
If you go to all of them and then you show the passport, then you get a special certificate and letter from me. So I will happily send you.
Will you take us all on a field trip?
That's great.
I have to say, what I love about presidential libraries is that not just that the museum reflects the man and his family and his background, and the era in which he served or grew up, but the place, because they choose that so carefully. So for FDR to be at Hyde Park next door to the mansion where he was born, Independence, Missouri, and Harry Truman, the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, and I'll never forget his funeral, and that they timed it so that the sun would be dropping behind those mountains as Nancy and her family walked away from the casket. And so when I go, it's like a pilgrimage for me when presidents are buried there. And so I'll remember going to College Station and the Bush 41 Library celebrating their 25th anniversary. And at that point, neither Mrs. Bush nor President Bush had passed, but their little daughter Robin had been brought from her original burial site in Connecticut to where they knew they would someday be. And soon after that, when I was there, we're both buried there. I have some questions from the audience, but again, if you have your questions on your cards, hold them up and Alfred will come pick them up. One was back to the declassification process. How does that work? Who decides when it's time to release something that's been perhaps highly classified at the highest level, and that it's okay now to release it? Who makes that decision, and what criteria do they use?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think sometimes people think that at the National Archives we have the power and authority to declassify information or documents. We do not. The agencies or the equities that classify material are the agencies and equities that declassify material. And this is particularly complicated with presidential records, because a lot of time presidential records are classified by more than one agency. So they could be stamped, with multiple classifying authorities or agencies on it. So in order to get that record or that document declassified, the National Archives has to work with each one of those classification agencies or equities to declassify it. And only when all of them agree about its declassification can that document or record be declassified. It's really important, because sometimes people say, why isn't the National Archives putting more resources into declassification? Yes, we do have people at the National Declassification Center. We have 60 people who work there, who work alongside. It's amazing, in a very secure facility in our College Park location, there's people lined up in rows in stacks. And that's people who work for the National Archives, who are experts in classification authority, working alongside representatives from various classifying agencies or national security agencies, sitting alongside each other, elbow to elbow, and working really painstakingly to declassify those documents. But the resources that go into declassification, I believe it's less than 1%, opposed to the resources that go into classifying documents every day in the United States. In other words, so it's 100 to 1 about what the money we're putting into classifying those documents. The declassification is much under-resourced.
And as much of a problem or a challenge, let's say, it is on the declass side, as you just alluded to, the issue for so many is the overclassification of records,
that's right.
Making it that much more difficult to get this material out when documents are classified in ways that they perhaps should not be.
And well, here's a timely topic from our audience. Are there significant efforts underway to use AI, artificial intelligence, to assist with declassification review? So maybe say a word or two about AI generally and how that might be impacting the work of the archives. The Miller Center, for example, is now, in part through Mark's leadership, as well as Miles Efron here, has just done a white paper on that topic, on how AI could help us with all the vast quantities of materials that we have produced that are now archived, our recordings, our oral history recordings. But any thoughts about that, how it can change the work, how it can help what you do, but this specific question might be on declassification itself.
We are not working right now, once again, again, we're not working right now to use artificial intelligence to declassify materials. Once again, we would have to be doing that in concert with intelligence authorities and classifying agencies. I think that's definitely going to be in the works for sure in the future. What we are doing is we're starting to do pilot projects in a lot of areas in AI. One, I just was briefed on a few days ago. We are going to use it to start to look into FOIA, which I think is really in a big way in which we are able to provide access to documents, particularly presidential records. So we'll start out with trying to use AI for pattern recognition to try to identify some of the FOIA restrictions.
Freedom of Information Act.
Freedom of Information Act requests, because once again, those have to be reviewed line by line right now by our archivists. But if we could use AI to do a first pass, and then we bring in our very trained archivists to be able to then provide the authority to be able to release those documents, that's one way we could use artificial intelligence. One successful way we've used it is through military veterans records. You may recall we had a very big backlog of military veterans records requests at the National Archives due to COVID during the pandemic, where a lot of these records are still in paper format, and not being able to have people work in person enabled a huge backlog of veterans requests, over 600,000 veterans requests. Just last month, we cleared that backlog. It was a huge effort. It was something that I was really focused on my first 7 or 8 months as archivist of the United States, to be able to clear that backlog. We did an AI pilot during that backlog clearing, which, if you know, a veteran's record that it has been digitized, which the more recent ones have been digitized, and we're working backwards with the VA chronologically. A veteran's record could be hundreds and hundreds of pages, but the AI was trained to go in and pull the DD-214, which will satisfy a large portion of our requests, because that's the summary of the veteran's record. Pull that DD-214 out of a very complex file, recognize it, and then be able to serve it up to the veteran through an automated process. And we found great success with that. So we're going to continue those types of pilots through pattern recognition that will reduce our time spent on any one given record, and will free our archivists up to be able to do the more complex requests that we cannot solve right now with AI. So it's a very good story, and we are authorizing pilots. There's an executive order on AI, there's an OMB memo on AI, and we're following that guidance to be able to figure out ways that we can do our work more efficiently at the archives.
You mentioned, Colleen, in our preparation for today, that President Biden has set up a task force about presidential records and transitions, presidential transitions, so not simply focusing on records of presidents, but also generally transitions and how that relates to presidential records. So can you tell us about that task force? Are you serving on it, or others from archives serving on it? What are the goals?
That's just started, so we just got word about that about a week ago, and we will have 2 individuals from the National Archives that will serve on that task force. Our counsel, who is our FOIA officer and helps with issues concerning presidential records, counsel back and forth with the White House counsel's office, and then we will have a senior member from our archival community who will also be serving on that task force. I think it's focused on general transition issues, but it's also particularly focused on the transference of classified information. Of course, President Biden being concerned about that and wanting to make sure that procedures and processes are in place so that we don't have any errors or mistakes if there would be a transition, either now, coming up at the end of this year, or 4 years from now.
So whenever the next transition happens in the presidency, I just have a question in my mind. What's the physical disposition of physical records? In other words, does someone pull up a truck to the White House and say, hi, we know tomorrow is Inauguration Day, or next week is Inauguration Day, and here are our banker's boxes that you might want to be using, and obviously if you've been packing up before, we're here with the moving people to help you. How does it get physically properly when it is following the Presidential Records Act from the White House or the old executive office building to wherever it needs to go in the National Archives.
Right. So, we do courtesy storage all along during a presidency, so we're not starting on January 20th to unload, 4 or 8 years all at that time. So we do courtesy storage ahead of time. But once again, under the Presidential Records Act, even though that is under courtesy storage for us, that is under legal authority of the White House and the President. So we are not the legal owners of those records. We're just simply entering into an agreement with the White House to engage in some courtesy storage for them until the term of office ends officially. But on that day, we do use, as I understand, I haven't lived through a transition yet, but we'll see, if it happens this year or if it happens 4 years from now. We do, the military does assist us, and the General Services Administration with, of course, there are going to be records and there are going to be materials that have to come out that actual day. And there are. It's a huge coordinated effort of, as you know, from working at the White House Historical Association, also moving vans and things like that, because the President and the First Family occupy the White House really up until the moment in which they exit to leave if they are attending the inauguration. So it is a very coordinated effort. That is part of what we will be reviewing very helpfully through President Biden's task force, which I am very supportive of him doing. I commend him for addressing the problem straight on. Let's find out where the concerns are in the transition, and we have enough months now that we can address them and fix them if there needs to be a strengthening of those procedures.
And that's such an amazing time, isn't it, in our history, the handing over of the baton, or as Kennedy would say, the passing of the torch from one president to the next, one administration to another. And we have some great oral histories. One that comes to mind for me is Josh Bolton's about being the chief of staff for Bush 43 and staying there in the White House, in the West Wing, up until noon, and then watching the poster-sized photographs of that president coming off the wall, or the personal memorabilia of the president that he keeps in the Oval Office being packed up, because you've got to get out by noon. There's no way to overstay, or shouldn't be a way to overstay your time there. We're coming to the end of our hour, the appointed noon hour to stop, but I have another question about records that people will read about periodically in the news, and some of them will be released at some point, and then there'll be a big flurry of activity. And those are the records related to the Kennedy assassination, to the John Kennedy assassination. Can you tell us about those and where that stands, and where are those in the archives, and where did they come from?
Right. So those records are at various different locations throughout the archives, but the really good news about that is that we are prioritizing them for digitization. There's about the equivalent of about 5 million records in the JFK assassination files. And I think the digitization will take a couple more years to be able to fully execute on all the available material. There's a very small amount that has not been made available. There was directives under directives of President Trump and President Biden to be able to make available as much of the collection as possible. And as I understand it now, all the materials that are able to be made available have been made available. In other words, they are open to the public. What is being withheld now has been withheld from, once again, equity agencies. And there were, as part of the law, there was a procedure in which those equity agencies had to explain why they were withholding. They didn't have to go into great details, but provide rationalization for why they're withholding certain redactions or certain portions of records. And a lot of it is that there's sources or related people that are still alive. A lot of it has to do with locations and places that are still being used by our intelligence services as in intelligence, surveillance. So they don't want to be able to reveal those locations. citations and specific pieces of information. But those are from all facets, not just, those are from the Oswald files and all those types of things, but also the congressional investigations, the Warren Commission. All of those records are gathered together under the JFK assassination files. And like I said, they are at various different places throughout the archives, but they will all be centralized because they will be digitized on the JFK assassination files webpage. And we continue to add those records as we move through the digitization process.
So on a related point to end on, can I ask you to tell us the line, if I'm sure you remember, that you ended at the Library of Congress for the Presidential Site Summit, and this past September, and my colleague Sheila Blackford and I were there. Sheila's our librarian here at the Miller Center. But you said something that will always stick with me about the importance of preserving archives and having access to them.
Sure. I mean, I view the National Archives. The National Archives is not it's not a luxury. It is a necessity for a democracy. As you know, if you study democracy or democratic theory or the history of democracies, you must have transparency and you must have, as you said, accountability in a democracy. And without records, you cannot have accountability or transparency in a democracy. Therefore, your democracy cannot survive. It cannot be healthy without a place like the National Archives to preserve our history and preserve our records. So it's very, very important. It is not a nice to have, it is a necessity.
I think that's the perfect way to end, and we want to end the way we end often our oral histories, and that is thanking you for your service to our country, both at the Congressional Research Service. I consider the White House Historical Association to be a public service, certainly now as the archivist, and obviously Mark and Russell, who are contributing to these archives themselves through their work here at the Miller Center, and all of you here and online who support the Miller Center. And we think this was so appropriate for President's Day week. I use the phrase, every day at the Miller Center is President's Day. So thank you so much, and thank you again, Colleen.
Thank you.